Team 1, stand by. Copy. Team 1, standing by.
Hey guys. So on this episode, I wanted to talk about something that I've personally experienced. Something that I went through on my own. I say went through on my own. I went through myself, and because of that, I think that it allows me at least a little bit of room to kind of talk about it. Of course, while talking about it, I'll kind of lay out the backstory on what brought this particular topic to light. In particular, it's talking about managing your stress following a critical incident. So, we had Pete on a while back and we talked about critical incident debriefing and things like that. But at the time that I first experienced something that, kind of felt like should have had something along those lines, I didn't get the opportunity. That's the short end of it. Through no fault of anyone in particular, at least not an intentional fault. It was just one of those things where, there were other individuals that were deemed more important for it at the time, and they were the ones that got it, and I'm glad they did. So the particular incident that I'm referring to is, I'm going to keep it vague because the topic itself is already, I don't want to say risque, but it's already kind of a sensitive topic to begin with. But if any of you have been following or know me personally, you know the kind of supervisor I am. I take a personal interest in my people and the people that I supervise and that I manage. I make their well-being my personal goal. My goal is to make sure everybody on my team gets home at night. And that even means if it's to the extent that it costs me mine. I've said it before that I would rather take the hit than any of my people if that's what comes to happen. In reality, that may not be the case. But in my heart, that's how I feel. In my mind, in my heart, as their supervisor, as their leader, I would prefer to take the hit so that they could go home and spend the rest of their time with their families and their loved ones and their friends and so on. And there's no altruistic reasoning behind it. It's just the way I've always felt. This particular incident, I wasn't called to the scene initially. There were other team members that were called to the scene, and they got there and the situation started to evolve. I wasn't on the scene, but I was, obviously listening to everything on the radio and paying attention to what was going on. And, you're always told, trust your gut instinct. And while I'm listening to what's going on the radio, my gut instinct was telling me this wasn't going to be the ordinary call. This was for this particular type of call, it wasn't going to go the usual way. And because of that, I went ahead and got in my vehicle and I started toward them. Hadn't been called. There had been nothing said on the radio at the time that, required me to respond other than my own gut feeling. So I left and I'm going. Driving normal, because I'm trying to tell myself, okay, it's just a gut feeling. There's nothing that's been said that should cause you, any kind of alarm right now other than you probably should just go. So I was driving normal, and then it happened. I heard something over the radio that as a supervisor, I had not heard before. It heard it for other shifts, heard it for other agencies, but I'd never heard it for my own. I'd never heard it from my own shift, where I'm the supervisor and those people are my responsibility. What I heard on the radio was shots fired. Now, I didn't know if that meant that my teammates had been shot at, if they had shot at somebody. I had no idea. All I know is I had a team member key up on the radio and announce shots fired, which automatically, you can imagine, gets a response from, everybody even remotely close. And I put the hammer down. I threw on the lights, threw on the siren, and put that pedal to the floor. And when I tell you that Dodge Charger couldn't go fast enough, that's an understatement. I believe if I could have teleported to the scene, I would still complain about how long it took, because it felt like it took an eternity for me to get there. And thinking about all this, I want you to keep in mind the kind of stress that's building up in you as an individual, as a supervisor, as a professional. Think about the kind of stress that's building up in your body. I'd already had the stress of the gut feeling. I already had the immediate stress when I hear shots fired. Now I'm adding to that, driving in an emergency response at a high rate of speed. That stress there. And then there's all the thoughts that are going through my mind, because obviously my teammates are focusing on the job at hand. So they're giving radio updates if they can, but they've got more important things to do than just sit there and chat on the radio with me. So I've got that stress running all the different scenarios through my mind on what could be going on. I get in the area, get to the street, pull onto the street, immediately stop my car. And as I pull up close, my headlights cast a light across the roadway and into the yard where they were. And I could see my two teammates that were there. They were taking cover behind a tree. So I got a little relief from that, because obviously they were both still standing. However, I still didn't know if either one of them had been hit. I didn't know if the threat was, still directly where they last saw them or what. So I bail out the car, grab my rifle, and I start trying to gather some information. All the while, I'm hearing sirens in the air from other responding units. I'm hearing people key up on the radio saying that they're on the way. And I'm still trying to gather information from my teammates on what's going on. And turns out that, they had an active shooter inside the house. Someone had grabbed a gun and brandished a gun and was preparing to fire on my teammates. And that was when the call went out. So at the moment that I got there and we're assessing everything, we still don't know the status of the active shooter. We don't know what their status is. We don't know if they're still in the same place they were. We don't know if they were hit. We don't know anything, because they can't be seen. So that adds another layer of stress, because now you've got that layer of stress added on top of everything else, of whether or not that person has slipped out through a back door, out through a window, whatever the case may be, and is now setting up for an ambush, or is circling around using the shadows, because this is all happening at night. Are they circling around in the shadows, getting ready to start picking us off? So there's that added layer of stress on top of all that. In the meantime, more units start showing up, and as they're getting there, I'm giving them directions on where I'm wanting to go, because one of the things that you want to do is you want to try to create a perimeter, lock down the situation so that it doesn't go beyond where it already is. You don't want to put any extra civilians at danger. You don't want the chance of the person getting away. You don't want them to have the opportunity to gain an advantage over you. So the goal was to get a perimeter set up. So I start directing people, hey, go over to the 2-3 corner, go to the 3-4 corner, get to this corner, get to that corner. And in the meantime, my direct supervisor at the time, who wasn't on scene yet, gets on the radio and says, hey, we need to start getting those houses that are immediately around you evacuated. And to be fully honest, I was immediately frustrated because I already had my hands full. I'm still trying to get a perimeter set up because I didn't have 360 degrees of coverage at the moment. So I'm trying to get that perimeter set up, and then someone who's not on scene is giving me orders on what I needed to do. So now, on top of all this extra stress, now I've got this frustration that's popped up. And they weren't trying to be malicious with it. They were trying to be helpful and trying to help me keep focused on all of the things that need to be accomplished. But at the time, I couldn't accomplish those things because I didn't have the resources available. I think at the time I only had a couple of individuals on one corner and a couple of individuals on another corner, which you can cover a object, a residence, a building, whatever you want to call it. You can cover it from two corners reasonably, depending on the size of it and the way it's cut. But that wasn't sufficient for me. For what we had going on, that wasn't sufficient. I wanted a full 360 degree coverage with as many people as I could get there before we made any other movements. So I get on the radio and I, okay, we'll take care of it just as soon as I can get enough people here to take care of this. And, looking back on it, I probably said it a little more unprofessional than what it was. But just like everybody else, I was in the moment too. I'm trying to focus on the task at hand, and that just wasn't the primary goal at the moment. It was obviously important to protect the other citizens who were asleep in their home and had no idea what was going on. But at that moment, my primary concern was making sure we kept the threat right where it was, that it didn't extend physically to another location, because what we're concerned with when we're doing stuff like that is strays, bullets that didn't strike an individual and then travel into the home of an unsuspecting citizen who's just minding their own business and they inadvertently get hit. We want to prevent that, which is the reason why we do things like that. So, it's a priority, but the main priority was, to me at the time, was keeping that physical security of where the threat was, keeping it exactly where it was. So as more people start getting there, I start getting, all the angles covered. And that's when we start, doling out people to go start waking others up and getting them to try either evacuate or take cover in their home. Because it's really hard sometimes to look at people and tell them, hey, you need to leave your home immediately. There's an immediate threat and you need to leave. A lot of people are going to be stubborn, especially here in the South. They're going to look at you. I'm not going anywhere. We can't. We obviously can't force them in that moment, and getting into a fight with them about it is not going to be beneficial. So we ask them, hey, at least take cover on the farthest end of your home. That way, in the event that rounds do come through, you guys have got some cover and you're further away. There's more objects for it to travel through, yada, yada. So all of that's being taken care of. We get the perimeter set up, and we're just kind of in a stalemate at this point, because obviously we've got command staff coming. We've got special units coming that are specially trained to handle these particular situations. So we're waiting on them to get there, and we're just kind of in a holding pattern. And as the supervisor is in the NIMS class, or the training that most public safety go through nowadays to make sure there's a unified command and communication and so on and so forth, things that they learned that they needed to do after September 11th, 2001. I'm the one in charge of all that. So I'm taking a step back and I'm trying to figure out, my head's swirling. I don't know what I need to do, what I haven't done, so on and so forth. So I take a knee next to another supervisor who showed up to help out. And I'm not saying anything to him. He's not saying anything to me. We're just sitting there. And he looks up at me because he's in a prone position with his rifle pointed at the residence. And he looks up at me and he says, "Sarge, are you good?" And I needed that. I needed that little break of concentration, that break in thought to kind of help me. I'm trying to think of everything, and I just don't know that I've got everything done. I feel like there's more that I need to get done, and I just can't think of it right now. And thankfully, because, he was covering his one responsibility at that moment, he said, well, can I make a suggestion? I said, absolutely. He said, what about we pull some people back that are closer in and start pairing people up and, start pairing teams up so that they've got variety of tools that they can use if they have to engage threat. So, that sounds like a good idea. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And that individual doesn't know how helpful that one moment was, because that one moment helped slow my brain down. It helped slow my thought process down. And the information he gave me was beneficial to what we were doing. I don't think even to this day he knows how helpful and how much I appreciate just that one little moment. So we take care of that. Admin gets there, the special teams gets there, and finally decide we're going to breach the home and start going after the threat. Long story short, as far as that goes, the threat had been neutralized upon the first call of shots fired. Everything we were doing was by the book and right, everything else, but the threat had already been neutralized, and there was no more threat. So in any kind of event like that, every agency I know of will secure the scene, and a special investigative team will come in, whether it's a state agency, whether it's a division of the same agency. They've all got their own different things. If it's another agency from a neighboring area, it's all set up to have another special investigative team come in and start to investigate what happened. Was there any wrongdoing on the side of law enforcement? Were there things that could have been done to avoid this? What happened? We all want to get down to what happened and how we could have prevented it, and so on and so forth. And if there was wrongdoing on the side of public safety or law enforcement, we want to hold them accountable. We've seen it play out in the media many times now where there has been wrongdoing. I'm not going to sit here and say that all of the ones that played out and have played out in the media have, been just, but there are some, most certainly, that, there was wrongdoing on the side of law enforcement. And I think it's important that we can address that those of us in the profession can acknowledge and address when things like that happen, because you'll hear all of us say, nobody hates a dirty cop more than a good one. And it's because anytime something like that happens, it affects all of us. It doesn't matter where in the country it is, it affects all of us. So it's important that we find these things. It's important that we address them and we deal with them. And if somebody needs to be criminally charged, that they're criminally charged. It's important that this is done, because we do have a responsibility to the public to maintain that trust. And as time has gone on and various reasons outside of individual control, that public trust is something that can be hard to keep or to earn back at times. So anyway, moving forward, I'm getting sidetracked. So we're standing by and we're waiting for this agency to come in. For us, it was a state agency. We're waiting for them to come in and start their investigation. Of course, all of the emergent stuff is already over with. So, they're getting out of bed, getting dressed and trying to get to us, but they're not in no big, huge rush because there's no reason to. We're holding the perimeter, we're holding the scene down. So, and we have to do that until such time they get there and finish their investigation. So there's nothing for us to do. And while we're waiting, at some point, I start looking around and I notice that my two team members that were involved immediately in all this, they're missing. I don't know where they are. I've got no clue where they are. And that adds just another layer of stress. Because while some of the other stresses may have left, there were other stresses that got put in their place. And just the stress of waiting alone can be enough to cause issues, to cause you stress. because you're just sitting around waiting. Whether it's because you need to use the restroom, whether it's because you got other calls going on, whether it's because you've got, a lot of questions with no answers. All of this creates a stress buildup in you. And then now you're adding to this, my two team members who I take a personal responsibility for, they're missing. At least to me, they're missing. What I didn't know is, the admin staff pulled them aside and said, hey, we're taking you back to the office. It's time to get you debriefed and, start getting you interviewed for what happened. But nobody told me this. And everybody's in their own little groups talking about whatever they're talking about. And I'm just kind of standing there. Everybody else that was not needed at the time was released and they'd gone home. But for the rest of it, it was me standing there in the middle of this street in a subdivision, looking around at these little groups that are piled up, people talking or doing whatever, and nobody's talking to me. I'm the on-duty supervisor. Those were my people, and no one's talking to me. Nobody's telling me what I need to do. And of course, we've got an SOP on how to handle things, but there's only so much that an SOP can detail out, because if you start getting too specific in them, you start limiting options on how to handle situations. So, as far as I understood our SOP at the time, I was out of options. I didn't know what else there was to do. I'm the on-duty supervisor, and the second command supervisor was involved in this incident, and another team member was involved in this incident. So I've only got a limited number of people on the street handling calls. I'm tied up here. There's no supervisor actually, assisting with any calls going on the street. And here I am, sitting here twiddling my thumbs trying to figure out what's going on. So I turn and wind up walking down the street to where my vehicle is. I'd used it to block off the road. And I'm standing next to it. And finally, one of my supervisors comes over to me and he says, hey, you good? What's going on? And I said, no, honestly, I'm not. I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to be doing right now. He said, what do you mean? I said, where are my people at? What am I supposed to be doing? What is there for me to do right now? I feel like I need to be doing something and nobody's talking to me. And he said, well, honestly, your people, they're going to get debriefed. They're getting ready for their interview and so on and so forth for the incident. And the rest of it, there's really nothing to do. It's just wait. We got to wait for the agency to get here to start doing the investigation. And a little more conversation happened. And eventually I was like, okay, well then can somebody else come take my spot so I can leave? And he said, yeah, are you good? I'm like, yeah, I just need to leave. He said, okay. So we got somebody to fill my spot and I left. And I rode around the rest of the shift, no knowledge of what was going on with my people. Really no knowledge of what was going on back at that house. I just went back to work and started trying to get back to my job at hand as the supervisor on duty at the time and managing the calls that the rest of my team was having to deal with. And then a few days later, they wound up having a critical incident debrief to where they called in the individuals that were involved in the situation and they went through the critical incident debrief with them and everything like that. I didn't get invited. At least in my opinion, I was just as much involved in it. Heard everything on the radio the same as everybody, first on scene after the call for shots fired went out, and then managing, that chaos that was ensuing at the moment. I was very much involved in it, but I wasn't invited to the debrief. I get back to work and I find out, we had that debrief the other day. I said, what debrief? Oh, well, we called so-and-so and so-and-so in and, we did the critical incident debrief. I was like, okay. Now, I would have liked to have gone to that. I've never been to one and, I kind of had my own things with that. Oh, all the different things that were said at the time. And it wasn't intentional. And I don't want it to come off as that, I'm saying that was an intentional thing, because it wasn't. It's, I wasn't the one that pulled the trigger. I wasn't the one that saw the person present the gun, and so on and so forth, and on the macro view, those individuals are the ones that were affected by it. So, it makes sense, Fortunately, since then, we've gotten better about that. And, when we have to do critical incident debriefs, pretty much everybody from top to bottom, multiple agencies that were involved, they all get invited. Everybody that may have had something to do with it at the time get invited to the critical incident debrief. And that's something that should happen. It's a positive thing. But, because I didn't go to the critical incident debrief, I was left to deal with the rest of that stuff on my own, because like I said earlier, we have an SOP, but there's only so much that SOP can cover. There's only so specific that SOP can be before it starts really limiting what options you have on handling situations. And I'm sure there's probably some other agencies that have some kind of, promotions manual and yada, yada, yada for, when you move up in rank and you start becoming a supervisor. But we're not one of those. Our promotion system is vastly different than that. And everything you learn as far as how to be a supervisor comes from the supervisor before you. When you're a corporal, your ability to supervise comes from on-the-job training from your sergeant or any training classes you may go to. But those training classes are talking about leadership, but they're not talking about active shooter situations. Obviously there's classes that are, but they're general because it's not specific to your agency. And in our line of work, you don't just have to adhere to the law, you have to also adhere to your agency's policy, your SOP. Because if you violate that SOP while handling the situation, even if what you did was legal under the law, you can still have repercussions civilly if you violated your SOP. So, that's a lot to put on individuals. And when you're moving up in the ranks and becoming a supervisor, it's your supervisor's responsibility to make sure that when you make that next step, that you're prepared for it. And despite the efforts of my sergeant before I was promoted, despite his efforts, we never had an officer involved shooting. We never had an active shooter situation for me to see how he handled it, for me to learn from him on what should be done. Everything I learned regarding situations like that were through conversations, through what training I could get, through knowledge of our SOP. So, when it come down to the metal meat and the bone, it was on me. And then once it was all said and done with, I had no outlet for my questions. I had no outlet for the stress that I had been under. And if you don't think that hearing your people, your teammates call out shots fired, and knowing that their lives are imminently at risk, if you don't think that's something that will affect you as a supervisor, then either one, I don't believe you're doing your job like you're supposed to as a supervisor, as a leader. Sorry, it's just the way I feel. Obviously you should be able to be calm, collected, and manage things. But if that doesn't make you feel some kind of way, then I question your ability as a leader, because you should take a personal responsibility in the well-being of those that you're responsible for, at least in my uneducated opinion. So I had all of that on me. I had all of that stress, and it was left on me to manage it, and I had to, but I had to first be conscious and aware that I was experiencing it. I had to be conscious and aware that what I was going through was affecting me. And then I had to find ways of dealing with it. Now, my ways of dealing with it were going back to our SOP, having conversations with others that were there, others that had been in similar situations, going to the gym and working out, using physical exercise as an outlet for the stress and the energy that had built up in me. You know, um, I had to find some positive ways to cope with all of that so that if and when that ever happens again, I'm ready for it. So I honestly don't really know how to end this one, other than, just kind of telling you, and I don't want this to come off as, oh, well, it's a cop thing or a public safety thing, because every individual, regardless of their profession, can experience a critical incident, something that's going to cause them stress, something that's going to cause them some trauma. And it's not just those of us that do this for a living. And I say us because it incorporates all of us, because dispatchers, law enforcement, firefighters, EMS, witnesses, all of us, when these things happen, all of us experience it. So you don't have to be in the profession in order to, go through this. And a traumatic incident for someone who's not in public safety could simply just be a really bad auto crash. Maybe they witnessed an auto crash and, they ran to the scene to try to help out, and, they saw the destruction that occurs to the vehicles and the human body when those things happen. That can be traumatic. So what I'm talking about in particular, I guess, with all of this is we need to be aware as individuals, not just as public safety professionals or anything like that, but just as individuals. We need to be aware of that stress. We need to be aware of how it's affecting us. And we need to make sure that we've got positive ways to manage that stress, positive ways to manage it, positive ways to overcome any trauma we may have gone through with it, whether it's through critical incident debriefing, whether it's through, positive actions on your own, whether it's going to the gym, spending time with family and friends, going fishing, whatever. Um, we need to make sure that we're doing things like that. And for the love of all things, stay away from substances. You know, you go through things like that. If you're in the middle of dealing with the trauma, dealing with the stress, dealing with the memories and the thoughts and everything else, stay away from your substances. Stay away from your alcohol. Stay away from any kind of prescription medications or recreational drugs. Stay away from that stuff until you can. Obviously, I think the recreational drugs and things like that, stay away from those. But the other stuff, stay away from them until such time that you've dealt with it on a sober level, on a level that, you know, when you're sober, you're able to manage it just fine. Because those substances are only going to mask things. They're only going to hide it from you. They're going to suppress it. They're not going to make it go away. For every time you use a substance to try to solve an internal conflict, all that winds up happening is when that substance wears off, that problem's still there. It doesn't fix anything. So stay away from those while you're trying to deal with that. But the most important part of it is, like I said, acknowledge it, own it, address it, manage it, and overcome it. Whether that's something you have to do on your own or whether it's something you do, through a group activity like the critical incident debriefing, manage it, deal with it, push past it. Don't just shove it down in that little box that we all have inside of us, because every one of us have it. We all got that little box where when something happens, we just keep shoving things down in it. But at some point, that box is going to get full. At some point, it's going to start to overflow. And you don't want to have to clean up that mess, because that mess can be awful. It can be horrible. It can be costly. Emotionally, physically, financially, it can be costly. So don't just shove it down in the box. Compartmentalize it until you get through handling the incident, but once it's done, unpack it and start dealing with it. It's important because you're important. So, all right, guys, till next time, I appreciate it. Thank you for stopping by, and be safe.